Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure. I do have a book in Finnish, which is rather exotic. I've never been to Finland. I'm still trying to pronounce, so you correct me now. Onko kapitalismilla tulevaisuutta? Something like this. Does capitalism have a future? Stirbt der Kapitalismus? Есть ли будущего капитализма? Чи капитализм має будущность? So it's in many languages, and it's fun reading it. Then my own contribution was slightly more modest than those of my older colleagues. So Professor Wolfgang Nobel, is he around? Oh, yesterday told you that world systems analysis was dead and passé, so we tried to prove him wrong. Unfortunately, he left us. So Immanuel Wallerstein and Randall Collins are the two people who are on record actually having predicted, theoretically, the end of communism in Eastern Europe. Immanuel Wallerstein as early as 1969, and Randall Collins in 1978. It's published, kind of they are on record, and what matters that it's their theoretical prediction, meaning that they explain why, who, and when possibly would it happen. Unlike, say, President Ronald Reagan, who also very correctly predicted, that one day it will fall because it is godless. So this is not exactly a theoretical prediction, it's political and moral condemnation. So the question really was, my question in this book was, all right, so what was communism? So since people normally think that communism was alternative to capitalism, so what actually was the Soviet Union from the beginning to the end? So you can read it in Finnish and tell me what's the translation, if I can get it myself. Today I'm going to expand actually even bigger. And seriously, I spent the last 6 or 7 years, thank you, studying early humans, because it's a very fundamentally important question. What is there a natural social structure to human society? Has it ever been? And so we can learn only by looking into the social structures of other primates, primarily chimpanzee and bonobo, and there is a lot of very interesting research on that, as you probably know. So this is where I would have to start, and if we have time ever, and we won't have time, then I will tell you what are the possible projections into the future when we are all robots and cyborgs in the 22nd century. So if you wish, this is an attempt to create an update on Friedrich Engels, the origins of family, private property, and the state, which Russians stopped studying and teaching exactly in the moment when family and state power became extremely important in creating private property in their country, when they got a lot of very interesting material to study. But we also heard about modernization yesterday, and let me start with a very basic premise. So I'm not a very abstract theorist at the same time, because I do not believe that any global trend can have reality unless it is observed in micro situations. And on the other hand, there is no globalization if you cannot prove that this is it, you can feel it. On the other hand, lots of different small events must concatenate to form a global trend. So let me describe to you just one such event. Sometime in around 1890, not far from here, somewhere in Finland, in fact, the Korpilahti, where is that? Somewhere in Korpilahti on an estate called Piesanen, a young Finnish boy was late to work. He was cutting hay, as I understand, in summer, and also doing typical agricultural work. His name was Karlo Lepp. Pronounce it, does it make sense? So Karlo Lepp was late. It happens with unruly youngsters. It has been happening probably for 1 million years. But what is important, so when the owner of Piesanen estate began telling him how wrong he was, that he must bring his act together, he actually spoke back. And his own father, Kalle's father, was horrified by this. that you don't show, not only you are late, but you don't show disrespect to the owner. How could you? And that was the beginning of a brilliant, if difficult, career, because by 1916, Karlo Lepp was member of parliament, whatever was the parliament here, and an important leader of social democrats. You know how you start being a social democrat. And by 1918, he was already a communist. And he lost in the Civil War, though badly beaten, you know, but he was exchanged by the Finnish whites for the Soviet prisoners. He ended up being in the Soviet Union, where in 1937 he was shot dead as a spy by NKVD and in Leningrad. Those of you who know, the story of Karlo Lepp, know this is great uncle of your wonderful colleague Markku Kivinen. He writes, this is his family. Is Professor Kivinen? Not. So it's not too embarrassing. So this is a great, to me, this is a great story of what? I think this is the great story of the end of agrarian order. An agrarian order was not a nice thing at all. So if you read the latest, published 2 weeks ago, book by James Scott, Against the Grain, it is against grain-based agriculture. It's the bestseller emerging right now in Yale University Press. You can get it, James Scott, the same James Scott who is Weapons of the Weak, Domination and the Arts of Resistance, the famous farmer from Yale University. He lives on a farm. I once had the honor of eating lamb that he raised himself, he slaughtered, and he cooked himself, being his guest. So what was agrarian order? When did it emerge? It emerged probably 10,000 years ago, we all know, with Neolithic revolution in several parts of the world, mostly in the Middle East. Why did it emerge? Today, the debate on climate change uses almost interchangeably the word climate change and global warming, which is actually very wrong, which allows people like Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin to say that actually climate change might not be such a big threat to Russia, because Russians might not object Siberian temperatures going up a few degrees. I don't know what's the idea in Finland in this regard. The country becomes subtropical at some point. But the actual record of climate in the past shows that the climate was not warmer. It was extremely unstable. So agriculture was not possible for the first million years of human existence, not because they didn't have enough the brain and they lacked the knowledge of animals and plants, but because it did not make rational sense to domesticate animals and plants, because it was very unpredictable. A few years of normal weather, then a few years of a huge drought. So you could not afford to be a specialist. You had to be hunter-gatherer in one sense, or another. You have to go from woolly mammoth to little rabbits to fish. This was the recipe of survival, not specializing. The very important question whether those early humans had a social structure, or what was the social structure, was first posited as early as 1380 by the English monk John Ball. So you probably know, one of the ideologues and leaders of the peasant revolt in England, which had ended serfdom in 14th century England, in medieval England. So addressing peasants, rebel peasants in Nottingham in 1380, he used a small verse in medieval English. When Adam delved, which means in medieval English he was plowing. When Adam delved and Eve span, and Eve was doing woman's work, spinning cloth. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? So when there was only Adam and Eve, who was a noble? Were there nobles? Today, this question sounds slightly different. Were there elites among the early hominins? Like, did the Neanderthals have elite? And the answer is resounding no. Though it was a relatively large and fairly large and complex already society. And we know now from right now, our colleagues in primates are doing a lot of research on monkey behavior. So we know that totalitarian tendencies among the baboons, for instance, where you have big males with enormous canines and smaller females. We know about much more egalitarian and caring bonobos, who are now everyone's beloved species because they're so peaceful and so sexual as well, or very dedicated to each other gibbons, who live in family pairs. So there is actually a very big diversity. But for all the diversity of social form among other primates other than us, there is one very important feature which is right under the noses, and that's why we don't notice it. We are the only ape species that had left the tropics. All the rest are still there enjoying plentiful supply of mostly vegetarian food. We are the only one, and we left early on already. So fire probably was domesticated 1 million years ago already by erectus, Homo erectus, and this allowed them to spread, well, at least 20,000 years ago, all continents have been colonized except Antarctica somehow. This is an incredible achievement in terms of social evolution and biological evolution. Why was it possible? What made it possible? So Australian theorist Kim Sterelny gives a simple sounding answer. It's cooperative foraging. Cooperative, when we can afford to have extremely long period of childhood. And this very long period of childhood, you realize, that humans are not, well, those of you especially who teach first-year students realize, that they're not fully mature at the age of 18, when many dogs are already dying of old age. They are still absorbing, humans are still absorbing new information. This is extremely risky strategy in terms of evolution because so many bad things happen to children and teenagers. They can just disappear. So somebody must be taking care of them. I mean, literally feeding them, changing diapers, and eventually teaching them. And all along, somebody must be protecting them. So this is nothing that we can observe even among chimpanzees and bonobos. This kind of behavior. So there has to be a social structure, and that social structure, curiously enough, as Christopher Böhm, an anthropologist who previously studied Montenegrin tribes in the Balkans, and now he studies social structure of chimpanzees and bonobos, he came up with a very elegant hypothesis, I think, that the human social structure is also hierarchical, just like all the monkeys and apes. But the human structure, from the very beginning, was upside down. So it's not the alpha male or alpha female at the top. There is no alpha male. There is the whole community which together dominates the potential alphas. In fact, it's documented very nicely among many hunter-gathering societies that when somebody is trying to behave like a bully, the first line of defense for the community are jokes. Second, avoidance. Nobody talks to you. And third, well, actually capital punishment. So everybody gets together and very much like Agatha Christie's, the Murder on Oriental Express, they kill you in your sleep. If you try to take too much in forage and women from the community. From here we get a very interesting story also of the origin of religion. Here Friedrich Engels was wrong. So it's not the weakness of savages in the face of nature that bred religion. It was, in fact, a very smart way of putting potential alpha male and female gods into the realm where we are not competing with them anyway. So there are alphas, but they're up there. And beta are our diseased ancestors who are intermediaries between gods and us. Therefore, in our community, nobody can even have a claim to be alpha or even beta. So what's the point? Love your wife, take care of your children. This sounds very much like primitive communism. This is all very nice, but the obverse of that, there is always a trade-off in evolution, just like in economics. Is Barry Ickes is not here, isn't it? Just Today I was itching for a fight with economists, but all right, Barry escaped too. So, he's here. Barry, why are you? I'm coming to you. So, there is always, but one thing, where economists got it absolutely right. There are trade-offs. So the trade-off here is that increased solidarity inside your community creates increased, what is the aggression, collective aggression, what is the opposite of it with other communities. So if this kind of primitive communism is in our genes, genocide is also in our genes. There are very few animal species, ants actually is the other one, that so massively kill members of the same species. And so effectively in competition for the resources, which is food or females. So all that went on, and so all this prehistory went on more or less slowly, but very successfully, until about 10,000 years ago, when, boom, agriculture becomes possible. There is nothing good to be said about agriculture except that it really can feed many, many more people. It feeds them poorly most of the time. Because it's one thing is chasing antelopes and then enjoying a steak, and it's another, back-breaking, literally back-breaking labor with a hoe in the fields, and then you get some kasha or porridge. And this is actually not very nutritious. So those of you who read Jared Diamond, so his son used to be my undergraduate, so it used to be, Max, you can leave the room. I'm going to say something bad about your father's famous book. But Jared Diamond got it mostly right at this level. I mean, there are several levels to his theory, but at the level of basic nutrition and physiology, of course, there is no competition with Jared. There he really knows his stuff. And the worst thing about agriculture is that it cages people into the situation when they have to live next to their granaries, and granaries attract predators and plunderers. Granaries inevitably attract mice, on the one hand, so we have to have cats to chase the mice, but they also attract other humans, the humans with swords, who begin to specialize in hunting other humans. So evolution goes to the next stage, and they emerge, humans domesticate animals, but they emerge other humans who domesticate humans and turn them into beasts of burden. Because what could the peasant do with his hoe or plowshare against a sword? So once you have a sword in archaeological record, this is society of domination. Because sword is a sword, dagger, saber, they are all very expensive, always very expensive, and very specialized tools of dominating other humans. You don't chop firewood with a sword. You chop only humans with that. And this means that the humans, then the rest is very well-known theory of Charles Tilly, that feudal politics is all based on racketeering. So it's better to pay one lord than to be robbed by several. So it's the lords are selling protection primarily against themselves. So Sheriff of Nottingham and Robin Hood, it's never taken lightly. It's a long story of peasants resisting, fleeing into Finland, in this case, is a very interesting example, fleeing into the northern forests, hiding from the lords somewhere. To some extent, in some mountainous and swampy areas in the Caucasus or in Northern Europe, it was relatively successful. But in most river valleys, it could not be successful. People were caged in ancient Egypt, in China, in the Indus Valley, and that's why great civilizations, which means a lot of forced labor used to build something large and impressive. These began changing with modernization. So the question about modernization is not whether it's happening, but why it's happening when it does. Why it begins to happen 300 or 400 years ago. So the explanation that Richard Lachman, my colleague Richard Lachman, gives is, yes, Protestant Reformation. Okay, sorry, very short joke, since, I teach in a Middle Eastern university. It's a special challenge explaining what Max Weber had in mind to the class where nobody knows who are Lutherans. and ask if there are Christians other than Catholic or something, So yes, well, there are some others. So what happened, most importantly, is competition which did not end in anyone's victory. So these terrible wars of religion allowed, in a freak accident probably, allowed in the western part of Eurasia for the formation of several competing states. And these states began equally investing in larger and larger armies because this coincided with gunpowder revolution. And again, very simple technological question. What makes guns superior to bow and arrows? It's very simple physics. It doesn't take much training to become a gunman, because it doesn't really require much physical dexterity. While archery, well, look at Robin Hood, you have to practice it your whole life, which brings to a very rapid proliferation of armed forces all across Europe. So I come up with 10,000 gunmen, somebody comes up with 100,000, you have to feed them, you have to equip them, and they are peasants. Because where else, this is an agrarian society, where else do you get them? The earliest, of course, the earliest peak of mobilization is reached by Sweden in this part of the world, because they figure out that the environment is so poor, it makes no sense to use the peasants as the source of rent, economic rent. It makes a lot of sense to use peasants as soldiers instead. This is Gustavus Vasa and everything, after him. Very soon, the Russians learn from him, Peter the Great. What makes him great? To do the same trick, conscript peasants into a very large army, which creates a very large Russia. It's another very useful, sometimes it's very useful to ask idiotic questions. Why there are so many Russians compared to Bulgarians or to any other Slavs, even Ukrainians? There are so many Russians and Russia is so big. Well, because Russians were unlucky for the first 500 years to be bordering on the steppe and on the nomadic warriors. And for the following 500 years, they were very lucky to border on the steppe and nomadic warriors, which they conquered all the way to China in the first 80 years, less than 100 years after acquiring guns. And then went all the way to Alaska. So why Russia is so big? For the very simple reason, Sweden could have been so big, it just Sweden ran into Russia at the time. So this comes to culmination in the 20th century, when wars become even bigger. There is still competition. This is remarkable. There is not single big empire emerging in the center of the world system. There are several. And in 1914, they dominate the whole world. But in August 1914, they basically commit suicide. They kill each other inadvertently because they mishandled the technology that they have acquired. And that technology fell into the hands of those former peasants, Karlo Lepp, and all these people who were led by Lenin and Stalin, who told them, grab the technology of warfare. Because what we call planned economy is actually, it doesn't come from Karl Marx. It comes from Walter Rathenau. Of course, it comes from Erich Ludendorff. Russians read mainly in German. And of course, they read Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, but they read also the German military planners, and they knew them very well. There were other examples, of course. Turkish intellectuals were mostly military, like the future Atatürk, because they didn't have universities. They had military schools in late Ottoman Empire. They read mostly French and Durkheim, and they come up with basically the Third Republic, laicité and democracy and nationalism, and this is your Turkish republic. The difference really between anti-capitalist of communists and anti-capitalism of nationalists is really just in the degree of nationalization. If you expel bad foreign big property owners, but leave in place your local good peasants and small property owners, so you are Arab or Turkish or Indian nationalist. You are Nasser or Atatürk. If you go radically all the way to expropriation of all properties, all productive properties within your realm, you become a communist. The communists were actually very successful. This is my disagreement with Barry. It doesn't matter that frankly, in 1917 doesn't matter. It's a mess, it's chaos. Many revolutionaries could come to power in 1917 or situations like 1917. What matters is 1919 and 1920. They're still in power. This is where the miracle is. How did they stay in power? And they retained power by becoming a World War I vintage fighting machine. And because very soon they realized that there will be another great war, they massively, under Stalin, they invest in building World War II vintage war machine and the industrial capacity to produce those tanks. So Professor Ickes was speaking about a truck, a peaceful vehicle, moving along the wrong road. I would rather say it was a tank. And the Japanese were doing actually exactly the same. They were building in Korea very similar plans in case Americans would bomb them out in Japan itself. So why did the Soviet Union move to the far north? Because they didn't care about the cost. The cost was survival, the cost was geopolitical, and in this respect, the Soviet Union was very impressively successful. It fought a war against Nazi Germany itself. Basically, in the early 1940s, it fought the war against the European Union, which was called the Third Reich at that time. So it was, with the Brexit, after Dunkirk, minus British Isles, it was the whole Europe at the time under command of Hitler and his planners. And the Soviet Union managed to produce more tanks. This is very impressive. The country which in 1929 could not produce a single truck or tank, by 1944 outproduced Europe 6 times. This is a very big achievement. This is the first materialization of catching up development, but this is a trap, and this is really a very big trap, because no corporation that had committed big success can change easily. This is not textbooks of economics. This is actually Max Weber. Your geopolitical glory continues to dominate you. And it remains to tell you, something all very simple. Soon we will watch, I'm relishing, the horrible British comedy, The Death of Stalin. But it's actually a very important episode in history. So why, by 1953, Stalin could no longer command his own state? So he built a totalitarian system of control in the end of the Great Repression of 1938. He began dismantling it already in 1942. Why? Because the army was not fighting well enough. He needed to release more of the officers and planners into fighting the war on their own. He could never really bring back the bureaucracy of the Soviet apparatus to his heel, and the peasants either, the former peasants. So there are many people in this room who studied the transformation of Soviet society. Fertility rate, women just stopped having as many children after the war. People began moving into new houses. So the country was fundamentally transformed. And so Russia faces the big problem ever since 1953. What do you do with the economy which was magnificently fit for Second World War and which became redundant? What do you do with the economy and the army which were designed for many millions of conscripts in the country with a shrinking population? So this is the problem of first Lavrentiy Beria, then Khrushchev in the 60s, then Brezhnev preferred not to touch it in the 70s, and he had the petrodollars. Then Gorbachev tried to touch it, and Yeltsin tried to touch it, and now, if anything, Putin could be accused of not being active enough. So from the other side, if he is going to be a new Peter the Great, he is nowhere as active as those historical despots should have been. Were there alternatives? Yes, surely there was an alternative. I do not mean that there was an alternative to Stalin. There, actually, I doubt that there was a possibility, because you look at any modern revolution, which one did not end up in a great revolutionary emperor? Napoleon Bonaparte, or maybe Oliver Cromwell before him, in Tito, Mao, Khomeini, Atatürk, Gandhi, Mandela, for that matter. There is always some kind of great fatherly figure, a demigod, who is the hope of this society just emerging from agrarian condition. The hope of the people who are no longer peasants, against, like this Finnish boy, who are becoming urbanites, who are moving into cities and who are reinventing themselves as members of parliament or something else. And they're very successful at this. So there is a great leader always there. So there was no, I'm sorry, it's no Bukharin alternative or no Trotsky alternative in the 1930s. But there was an alternative in the 60s and 80s, and that alternative was joining the European Union as one Soviet Union. So let me finish with Emanuel Wallerstein's failed prediction to entertain you. In August 1991, the days of the coup attempt or putsch in Moscow, I was already in my office in Fernand Braudel Center in New York, and Emanuel said, well, so what's happening? I said, yeah, Gorbachev is finished. No, my friend, he's not finished. Yeah, there is one great trick he can play. He flies from the Crimea back to Moscow. There should be all these cameras. So he kisses Yeltsin like a good Russian, like this, and says, Boris, you're great. You saved Russia. You saved democracy. Here is a very big medal to you. Please stand to my left. I am going to unleash a purge against all these nationalists, separatists, reactionaries, all these people who oppose democratization and the European choice of Russia. And there is no better way of re-centralizing empire than a good purge. And Western human rights agencies would not give a peep if you sent in jail, the people in charge of August coup, and who knows how many there were. There would be maybe 1 million of them. And then Gorbachev renegotiates with the Germans, of course, the deep dream of German nationalists, creating a European Union between Berlin and Moscow, with the resources of Russia and so forth, and the capital of Germany. Americans are kicked out from the continent. They will have to create a geopolitical alliance with China and Japan. What else can they do? Poland and Lithuania, they can go anywhere they wish between Germany and Russia. Globalization becomes something very different and so forth. This did not come to pass, but failed predictions of great men could be just as important as those realized. And if you look at the acts of Putin, he is trying to paddle back to the situation of negotiations at the same level with world capitalism. He is trying to create a greater power. So back in 1995, Wallerstein and I predicted that the next president of Russia would be an officer. It was inevitable, that there will be a confrontation with the United States, there will be an officer. Now we predict that the next one will not be an officer, but confrontation will persist. Thank you very much.